Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to welcome you to this first 2021 Philanthropy Lunch organized by the Geneva Center for Philanthropy. The topic we'll discuss today is a highly relevant one. How can philanthropy support companies to advance human rights? To do that, we are partnering with Professor Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, who is director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, which has been created at the University of Geneva in July 2019. Besides being a professor at our university, Dorothée is teaching at the New York University Center for Business and Human Rights of the Stern School of Business. She holds a PhD from the University of Zurich. Dorothée will be presenting the topic more in detail and introducing the panel members in a few minutes. We have chosen an interactive format, first between Dorothée and her panelists, and then with our audience. To that effect, you're welcome to send us your questions in writing using the Q&A box, which you find on your screen. And we will address them during the Q&A session, which you have seen our program, which will be starting slightly after 1 p.m. We will end at 1:30 p.m. Sharp on time. And before that, I will tell you about the forthcoming activities, events, and teaching activities of the Geneva Center for Philanthropy. And at the very end, you'll be invited to complete an evaluation questionnaire. You will receive a link to that effect. We would be really grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to do that. Now, before I pass over to you, Dorothée, I'm very happy and proud to inform you all that the GCP has acquired since the 1st of January of this year a prestigious new strategic partner, and this is the Fondation de France, which is well known, and they have joined us since the beginning of this year. Over to you, Dorothée.
Thank you, Henri, and welcome everyone. Thanks for your kind introduction and for inviting us to team up with your Center for Philanthropy for this event. Your institution is so well established at the University of Geneva, and we're full of admiration for your work. So our institution, the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, is new, and we're still learning our way around the University of Geneva. But you and your team, like many others at the university, make us feel very welcome. So I thank you for that. I also want to welcome the audience and a quick backstory for you on this event. Henry, his colleague Letizia, my colleague Pascal Chavaz actually planned this event already last year. So Henry was one of the first people within the university to reach out to us as a new institution to invite us to work together. We set 2 dates for this philanthropy lunch prior to this one, but then we always postponed, hoping that we could have this event in person eventually. Well, we're not quite done yet with the pandemic, but certainly we learned a great deal in the past months how to engage through online events. And for today's topic, I actually think the timing is excellent. On this note of engagement, I want to reiterate what Henry said. Please don't be shy and engage. We have a Q&A box at the bottom and a chat box that you can use to send us comments and questions throughout the entire session. I will do my best to scan those contributions, and I'll try to weave them into our conversation. Henry will help in the end as we leave time for Q&A. So, let me do 3 things as a way of introducing today's conversation on the relationship between our 2 fields, business human rights and philanthropy. First, I'd like to briefly introduce the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights and our work, because this is important for understanding how philanthropy could help advance human rights in business. Second, I'd like to talk a bit about Ananjiri Devada's work, the author of Winners Take All. In the context of philanthropy, his point of view is certainly provocative. And while I don't want you to think that I promote his book or fully endorse his point of view, I believe he offers a lot of food for thought for our conversation. And third, I will of course introduce you to our expert speakers. I'm most grateful to have with me Giulia Neri-Castracane and François Zimeray. Both have impressive experience dealing with the intersection of business, human rights, and philanthropy. So let me start first to talk a bit about the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. As you heard from Henry, I'm faculty at the Geneva School for Economics and Management, and I'm directing the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. We launched the center in November 2019 as the first human rights center at a business school in Europe. The premise of our work is that corporations can be powerful forces for sustainable development. And for this reason, we're proud to be at a business school, because this is where future managers are trained, and we want to make sure that they become forces for good. I invite you to check out our new website, the gcbhr.org. I'm indebted to my colleague Pascal Chavaz, who tirelessly worked on the website in the past month to create this platform that allows us to finally show all our work. And Pascal, I know you're participating, so please use the chat box to put in the website link gcbhr.org for everyone to see. In our center's mission statement, we highlight two aspects of our work. First, we work with companies to understand their business human rights challenges. We want to support those companies in the development of business practices that allow the pursuit of profits to be fully aligned with the company's commitment to human rights. We think the close engagement with companies and our supportive role for those is relevant for advancing human rights in corporate practice. We engage closely with corporations, but at the same time, we make sure that we keep them at arm's length, because we want to do our research fully independent from corporate influence. Second, element that is highlighted in our mission statement is the objective to educate future business leaders. The management of human rights challenges in the business context, we believe, is one of the most underexplored challenges in business to date. Yet, if you open the newspaper, you can see that those challenges are pressing and they're urgent, and they occur on a daily basis. You may have most recently seen the debate about cotton coming from China, from a region where a Muslim ethnic minority, the Uyghurs, are forced to work in labor camps and help with the cultivation of cotton. You certainly saw the debates around the role of social media platforms for politically motivated disinformation. And in the context of the boom of electric vehicles that we need for a clean energy transition, you may have come across reports that talk about the challenges of sourcing critical battery minerals that we need to power those electric vehicles from countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo in a way that doesn't harm and violate human rights. To integrate human rights systematically in the business school curriculum, we actually work with a network of schools. We're very proud to be the first human rights center at a business school in Europe, but we don't want to be the only ones doing this. We have a strong partner in New York. I'm still the research director at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights, but we want to motivate a critical mass of business schools to look into the human rights aspects of business decisions. We think this is what makes business successful in the future. So let me take a pause here. I think at this point, I can imagine that you may ask yourself, how is business and human rights as a concept so different from the more popular concept, namely corporate social responsibility? And I don't want to spend much time on terminology, but in the context of today's conversation, this is an important distinction. So CSR, as you know, is a very broad concept. It has been around for several decades, and it still, to this day, means very different things to different people. So for companies, it often includes a range of activities that vaguely relate to society, including sponsoring, community engagements, or other forms of philanthropy. And it is often not related in any way with activities through which companies make their money. It is rather about how companies spend their money when money is left over. And I see this even more pronounced in the US context, than in Europe, where CSR is the corporate language to describe how companies are giving back to society. Business and human rights, in contrast, exclusively deals with how companies make their money. And as such, business and human rights relates to the very business models that generate profits. And it analyzes how core business operations impact human rights, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but how does this impact look like in daily business processes? Business and human rights also has a normative reference point, namely the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from which key principles such as non-discrimination, for example, can be derived. And this normative reference point is lacking in CSR, which I believe has enabled this wide range of interpretations that I just mentioned. So if business human rights becomes fully integrated in the way how companies organize their work, if respecting human rights is a non-negotiable business foundation, then one could ask, what is the role of philanthropy? This brings me to my second point of this introduction, namely Anand Giridharadas' work. His book, Winners Take All, from 2018, has the provocative subtitle, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. Let me quickly show it to you, it's on my desk. Here we go. He claims that today's philanthropy frequently uses money that was made in ways that are actually disrespectful of human rights in the first place. So then philanthropy is just a way to cover up or clean up what companies have previously destroyed. So it's a compensation strategy. His book was widely discussed, controversially discussed, but it certainly struck a nerve, with private actors taking on more and more important roles in a global governance context for problems that were once original and exclusive government tasks. The question of what kind of democratic control we have over the agenda-setting power of private philanthropies, I think, is a fair question. And I'm sure you've seen that debate most recently play out during this pandemic with, for example, the role of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, currently the biggest donor to the World Health Organization, which led to the rise of all kinds of conspiracy theories around COVID-19. Another example is the Sackler family's involvement in sponsorship of art. The Sackler family owns a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma that produces OxyContin. OxyContin is one of those drugs that is considered a driver of the opioid crisis in the US. And in March 2019, the Guggenheim Museum in New York decided to no longer accept gifts from the Sackler family. Why? Because that money was made in ways that does not correspond to values that Guggenheim want to be affiliated with. So in today's conversation, we want to explore the relationship between the field of business and human rights and philanthropy. And I think we can also touch upon practical ways how philanthropic institutions can navigate an environment that is increasingly skeptical of generous donations and the support of private actors for the delivery of public goods. So let me conclude this introduction with an example of the intersection between business, human rights, and philanthropy from the context of our work we've conducted at the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. In early 2018, we started looking into human rights issues related to cobalt sourcing from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Cobalt, as I mentioned, is an essential battery mineral for lithium-ion batteries that power our laptops, phones, but also those electric vehicles that are a key component of our strategy to transition to clean mobility. I traveled to the Democratic Republic of the Congo in September 2019 to analyze a pilot project that was set up by a private company to improve working conditions in so-called artisanal mining sites. Artisanal mining sites are sites where groups of miners work with very basic tools to, sometimes their bare hands, to extract the precious minerals from the ground. And the company's project that I looked at had actually created rules as well as monitoring mechanisms to improve mine safety, and to exclude child labor. These are the top 2 human rights concerns in the context of artisanal mining from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. What I saw in the context of this pilot project was in line with fundamental human rights standards. And it's important to note that what this company set up there certainly wasn't charity. They were also sourcing the cobalt from that site, and that was profitable to them. So they found a way to improve working conditions on this pilot project site, source from it, and do so profitably. However, to remedy child labor in such a context is more complex than organizing the mining site. What they did is actually they put up a fence around that pilot project, and they controlled the entry to the pilot project to make sure that no children had access to the mining site. So of course there was no child labor on that project side, but the reason why children are involved in this type of activity is because the communities there live in extreme poverty. So to remedy child labor is more complex. It has to extend beyond the fence around the pilot project side. One needs to understand that in this context, children don't have easy access to education. The schools are crammed, the education of teachers is lousy, and despite the promise of the government, education is not entirely free. The students have to buy books and uniforms, etc. And this is where the corporate foundation stepped in to complement the work in the company's core business. And with COVID, that role of the corporate foundation in this specific context became even bigger. Why? Because the pilot project site had to be closed. It had to be closed because the company feared that this project site could become the epicenter of a COVID outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country which has no basic health services, and I think a total of 5 ventilators in the entire country. So they couldn't take that risk, so they closed the site. Again, the philanthropic foundation stepped in and ramped up projects in the community to produce soap, to produce masks, and to prepare that community for a potential outbreak of a pandemic in that context, and to create jobs, because there are no alternative jobs to mining in that context. So for me, this was an interesting example where the corporate core business became aligned with the corporation's commitment to human rights, yet there were still portions that needed the complementary support of the philanthropic foundation of that corporation to meet the objective to operate without child labor and respect mine safety. So I hope in the conversation following now, we can solicit more examples of the interplay between business, human rights, and philanthropy. Please let me introduce you to the experts. I'll start with Giulia. Giulia Neri-Castracane is a Geneva-based corporate lawyer in one of the largest law firms in Switzerland. She's also the author of a PhD thesis entitled Corporate Governance Rules as a Means of Promoting CSR, Reflections on Swiss Law from an International Perspective. For this work, she was awarded the Walter Hug Prize. She's also a lecturer at the University of Geneva in philanthropy, and she is regularly invited in other Swiss universities, such as UCI and Fribourg, to lecture on CSR. She's a member of the Human Rights Commission of the Geneva Bar. Our second expert speaker is François Zimeray. Introducing him is hard because he has a very long, impressive career. He's a business lawyer, passionate about human rights. He was also a member of the European Parliament at a time when the European Parliament drafted the European Charter for Fundamental Rights. And he was a diplomat from 2008 to 2012. He was appointed by President Nicolas Sarkozy as the French ambassador at large for human rights. And from 2013 to, I believe, 2019, he was appointed as France's ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark by President François Hollande. And in 2015, he became the survivor of an Islamic terrorist attack in Copenhagen, where he was targeted together with other activists. And I'll start my conversation with François, and I also invite him to compliment on my introduction of him. We will structure the following 25 minutes around 3 questions for each expert. To you, François, very broad question to start with. How have you experienced the intersection of corporate responsibility and philanthropy in your long career as a human rights lawyer and diplomat?
Merci beaucoup. First, I would like to congratulate you for this initiative and to thank you for having invited me. I'm very grateful to you and to the University of Geneva, and it's an honor and a privilege for me to have this opportunity to talk to you. Unfortunately, it's in English, and as a former French official, I should not speak English except with a strong French accent, so I will do my best. And if I congratulate you, it's also because I think that a few years before ago, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, talking about business and human rights was didn't sound right. It was like an oxymoron. I'm a business lawyer as well as a human rights lawyer, and for long I've been one of the first French lawyers appointed to the International Criminal Court. And when you mention DRC, the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, some memories came back to my mind when I was a lawyer of a child soldier prosecuted by the court 10 or 15 years ago. I remember when I was a partner in one of the major French business law firms, but in the same time I was going to The Hague or to Congo for human rights. It was just seen by my friends and my partners as something nice but bizarre. I would say as if I was a golf champion. Human rights had nothing to do with business and core business. And after having been diplomat for 10 years, and especially in charge of human rights in French Foreign Service for 5 years, and coming back to the bar, I realized that these two fields, the one of human rights and the one of business, which were completely back to back in the past, now are overlapping. And but there are still a lot of misunderstanding about the meaning. And as a lawyer, I have to start by some definitions. And you put the finger of something very, very, very true when you explore the nuances and differences between the world of CSR and the world of human rights. And I realized that words have not the same meaning depending on the people who listen to them. And when you say human rights, people generally listen and they understand ethics, moral, virtues, and they expect from us symbols, gestures, especially from diplomats. In fact, I had to experience that. But one has to be very clear, and you put the finger on this, the question of the norms. Human rights are not made of moral. We are not talking about ethics. I know that this word is often pronounced in the business community. I would not use it too much. We are talking about rights, norms, rights that exist or don't exist, that are enforced or violated. The right of equality between men and women, the right not to be tortured, the right to access a fair trial, the right for a child to his childhood. And these rights are elaborated in what we call the multilateral arena. And Geneva is definitely one of the centers for the elaboration of human rights. And when I look in the back mirror, not only my short career, but if I try to see the course of human rights throughout the history of humanity, I observe I have some remarks. The first one is that this difference or this opposition between business and human rights is a very old one. Just think about those who have driven away the merchants of the temple 2,000 years ago. And still today, one finds people who think that if we are on the business world, you cannot be committed in human rights, and vice versa. And one could feel this opposition in the business community as well as in the human rights community. And I have also the impression that roughly throughout the human history, one could say that the cause of human rights is like a rocket with different stages. And the first stage of the rocket of human rights were born by individuals, courageous individuals, free thinkers, writers, painters, scientists. Some of them ended in fire, in prison, on the cross, in exile. So it was the first stage of the rocket. The second stage of the rocket, the second player, especially after World War II, at least at the middle of the 20th century, but it started earlier, in fact, was the international community. International institutions played a big role in setting up these rights and these norms. It is the second stage of the rocket. The third stage of the rocket, in the 60s, 70s, were the NGOs, the foundations, which became big players in the field of human rights. And now we are attending to the launch of the fourth stage of the rocket, which is the involvement of the private sector. When I was ambassador for human rights, I was, of course, a part of this diplomatic community, especially in the UN, in Geneva, in New York. But also I had the privilege to be on the field. And there are some missions I have made. I think I made more than 100 missions, most of them in places I would not recommend for holidays. And one of them, of course, I will never forget, for example, the Rana Plaza, where I were a few days after the collapse of the building. It was not a collapse of a building, in fact, it was a collapse of rights, of respect, of law. And I will never forget the empty looks of the victims who were just amputated the night before, by interns in a dusty hospital. And I realized as well during these missions that our tools were not sufficient to address the difficulties we were witnesses in all the continents and in all the fields. And I came to the conclusion that one of the most powerful tools to improve the situation of the respect of human rights would be to mobilize the private sector. And especially in the private sector, the financial sector. But also to shift from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to consumer social responsibility. And I think that today, when we will be able to inform the consumer of the consequences of its acts of purchase of a service or a good on human rights and environment, which progressively is becoming a part of human rights as well, we will have a strong leverage to change the world. So now we are at this very moment where this fourth stage of the rocket is being launched. And that's very important that the University of Geneva and the Center for Philanthropy of Human Rights, you educate a new generation of business leaders who could overcome these categories and work hand in hand with the philanthropy sector, and maybe as well with the diplomatic community and the NGOs, activists, all the players of fundamental rights. But I talk too much, so.
No, thank you, François. This was a fascinating historical account, and I love your metaphor of the rocket and the 4 phases. And you, in the end, came back to the role that philanthropy can play in this 4th phase as private actors contribute to the advancement of human rights that also require philanthropy to play a role. I'll come back to you later again to ask for more concrete examples, maybe in the context of Rana Plaza. Let me now get to Giulia and ask her how, from a legal perspective, those 2 worlds, philanthropy and business human rights, encompassed often in the concept of corporate social responsibility, to what extent they can have a binding effect on corporations.
Well, thank you. As you said, it's a two concepts, at least, the philanthropy and CSR, which are very difficult to define, because depending on who is defining them, you have a completely different, you end up with a completely different definition. But I must also say that to answer to your question, I still have to attempt to make some definitions. So the one I would suggest for CSR, which is a quite broad one, is to say that it's about integrating into the business activity and the business strategy of a company the societal expectation on ESG aspects, so environmental, social, and governance aspect. As you say, this definition might not be shared by some businesses, but this is the one I would like to propose to stress the link between the 2 of them. And then philanthropy, I will use the one which is proposed by the Center of Philanthropy, saying that it's the voluntary giving for public good. And so in that context, if you look at it, then you may see a link between the public good and the societal expectation on ESG aspects. And this helps you also understand that basically, I think that we can have 3 different visions of how philanthropy and CSR are linked together. The first one would be to say that philanthropy is one slice of the big cake of CSR. So typically the example you gave, Doro, on the corporate foundation, doing philanthropy, but maybe also there was obviously a business case in that, as you said, but this was probably also part of their CSR strategy. And they probably reported on it as part of the CSR strategy. Then you can also say, also maybe joining the example you already gave also in the introduction, that in the end, they don't share the same values. And that's another second school of thought of saying the relationship between the 2 of them, saying that in the end, with CSR, there is always a tie with the business, and whereas philanthropy should not have this. And in that case, since they have completely 2 different values, there are 2 different things, and there cannot be any intersection, true intersection between the 2 of them if you look at them at these 2 notions like that. And then the third one, which was also a bit promoted by the concept of creating share value of Porter and Kramer, is to say that basically CSR is an evolution of philanthropy, and in that context, they look at philanthropy as a pure philanthropy, completely disconnected of the potential impact it has on society, whereas CSR at least would like to reach some impact. And in that case, this would be that link. So this is about the link, and you can say that the link is related to the public good, and the public good is nowadays defined by the SDGs. And so here we have also the link through the SDGs between the human rights and also the environment. And we see, as François said, why it's becoming more and more pressing, and why the infringement to an environment also are related to human rights abuse. And then, if I'm not wrong, your question was to say whether, to which extent this was binding on corporation. Well, at this stage, and this is why we are here also to discuss it, the concept of I mean, specific legal provision on CSR are either inexistent or very limited around the world. It is a concept which has evolved from the voluntary world of code of conducts and soft law provisions. This has started to change with duties on reporting and due diligence obligation too. In Switzerland, at the moment, there is no CSR hard law provision, if I can speak from a Swiss lawyer perspective. That being said, I think we should not underestimate the ability of social society and its expectation to represent a sort of force normative, third normative force beside, I mean, next to soft law and hard law. And this is also why along this trend, we have seen around the world that consumer law and competition law has been used, I mean, namely in the US, probably you know, Dorothée, to make companies responsible for this human rights abuse and environmental law infringements. And this based on the ground of misrepresentation of the product that was sold or misleading information. And so this here you see also the importance of the how consumer can step up in the debate, as François said. And then you can also take into account the possible effect through the already existing due diligence duty, because the management has a duty to perform a risk assessment. And part of this risk, I mean, today that's for sure that the reputational risk is part of this risk. And so, I mean, the potential abuse on human rights and are related to this ESG aspect and the societal expectation you may have on it, and this goes in the end in the question of the management risk assessment on the reputational risk.
Giulia, may I interrupt you here?
Sure.
You made a great case for human rights in business. You highlighted investors want it, consumers want it. There are growing legal requirements to do this. But I was fascinated by your 3 ways for how to see the relationship between philanthropy and business human rights. And I have a follow-up question on that specific aspect, namely, during our current economic times, many companies are struggling. They're struggling to survive. So resources, they claim, are extremely limited. So in a world of very limited resources, what should have priority then? A business human rights approach, you know, where human rights are respected through core business processes, or philanthropy? And I think that changes the calculations that you've described in your model of sort of 3 different approaches of thinking about that relationship. Can you comment on that specific situation that we're in right now?
Well, I think it is obviously a difficult situation right now, but I mean, if the idea of a company is to survive, it's also to survive on the long term. And I think a lot of people also are watching at what the company are doing today. And I mean, if you do that against human rights, just to think at the short-term profit, this may have an impact on the reputation and then also on the value of your products, because we know nowadays that the value of a product product is not really only the value of the materials used to make a product, but also the brand. I mean, the importance of the brand. I mean, the value of the brand has an important role in the final value of a product. And I think if you want to keep being a player in the future, you still need to understand that this is a stringent topic, and that you have to take it into account and be very careful of what you do. And just as a lawyer, as you said, I mean, also the legal framework is changing and is coming to be is starting to be more mandatory or going in that way. So I think this has to be taken into consideration.
And for that long-term success, Giulia, you need both.
Yeah, sure.
Human rights and philanthropy. I'm asking you. So what would be your reaction to that?
No, but I mean, obviously, to have a long term, to survive on the long term, you first have to survive on the short term. Huh? That's for sure. But I don't see it as unnecessary as a contradiction. I don't. It's not that I don't want to answer the question, but I don't think we have to put the two questions in opposition.
I see. Is it either or, François? How would you react to this?
I think that we think in terms of categories. Mm-hmm. Either it is human rights, either it is philanthropy, either it is a company, either it is a holding or a subsidiary or a supplier. We have a tendency to put concepts in boxes, which is normal because this is what structures our minds and our legal mind especially. Mm. But I think that what we see is all these borders, conceptual borders between notions are becoming more and more porous and flexible. In 10 or 15 years ago, for example, in French law, the autonomy of what we call les personnes morales, of legal entities, was one of the basic of business law. Mm-hmm. And now one could see that the holding company can be liable for the acts of a subsidiary or can be liable for simply a supplier attitude. So these notions which were structuring our vision are becoming more and more, porous and sometimes vague. And I think that applies as well for this opposition between philanthropy and companies. Why? Because also the crisis of 2008 was not only a financial crisis which has led to an economical and social crisis. It was also a crisis of meaning, du sens, and it has changed a lot of the mentalities. I remember when I was starting my career, most of my friends, they wanted to become, they were dreaming about becoming a golden boys in law and finance and joining big companies, big names. And now it's absolutely the opposite. They want to make their own startups. They want to, their aspirations have changed. And I'm sure that this will be more and more visible after the COVID. The COVID crisis will reinforce this trend. So, and it has led to very concrete consequences, at least in French law. For example, the companies, they not only they have a purpose, in the articles of association, all companies should have the purpose, les statuts et l'objet social. What is the purpose of the company? They have also now what we call a raison d'être. Mm-hmm. And asking a company to, what is your raison d'être, means putting the finger of, aren't you also, don't you have a responsibility as a philanthropist player as well?
But that entails some risk too, huh? Of just looking at the raison d'être in the world of ethics and not of obligation, as
Absolutely.
you say.
I agree. You're right. That's why I always have insist on the fact that we are talking about rights and not about ethics. And this has a consequence in the company's policies. The improvements that have been made during the, let's say, the last decade in companies, and with the, how do you say, the impulsion and the efforts of the CSR community, these improvements were caused by the necessity to improve the image of the company, to be more attractive for the marketing of the product as well. And the goodwill in general was the drive, le moteur, c'était vraiment le goodwill. But I think that we find the limit of that. And as a lawyer, and I don't know if Giulia share, I'm sure you share this view, our argument is not the goodwill. It's not that you should do better because it's good to be good.
Yeah, sure.
It's good for your marketing, it's good for your image. No, it's simply because it's a question of risk for you and liability. So we talk the language of risk and liability in a world which was more accustomed to hear the language of goodwill and ethics. And it's a little, sometimes it can be clashing, in fact, because there are two different logics. But I think we are at this very moment now, where companies are realizing that it's not only a question of marketing, not only a question of attractivity for the staff, for a global image, for a promotion of the product. It's also a question of liability for the company and for the directors.
François, thanks. I really like your suggestion to break down siloed thinking. Also, it's not an either or question, but I promised the audience also concrete examples of the interplay between business human rights and philanthropy. So may I ask you to think of a concrete example where you've seen that cooperation between those two fields working particularly well? I want to solicit an example that could be exemplary for other contexts. I know you've worked on Rana Plaza, and I'll have the same question to Giulia
yes.
To conclude this initial round of the conversation.
Yes, I think the Rana Plaza is a good example, because the Rana Plaza was une prise de conscience, the moment where people took conscience of and created an awareness. And some companies, not all of them, but some of the companies who were involved in that business realized that tomorrow will be different than yesterday, and had to be different than yesterday. And for that, they had to change all the value chain, because the value chain can be a liability chain. And these changes were made in the processes, in the rules, in the materials, in the content, in the fibers, in the fabric, in the dye, in very concrete. These changes have been made hand in hand by a coalition of entrepreneurs, of enterprises who went ahead, and NGOs who were specialists and activists. And it was a very good example, because it's not only that the processes have changed, or it has not changed all the fashion industry. One could still have fashion victims. And when I say fashion victims, I'm thinking about the victims of our fashion. They still exist. But at least some of the major players, they have changed their processes, and very promptly. And more than that, they have also changed the vision of the rulers in the countries where these products are manufactured. I remember the discussion I had when I went, after having been witnesses this tragedy, which I will never forget. I went to visit the ministers in Bangladesh, and as a diplomat. And I remember the discussion I had with them. First, it was not easy to convince them. One has to keep in mind that in this country, at this time, 40% of the member of parliament were factory owners. So they were not keen to change the rules. It was especially difficult for that. But they changed, not enough, but they started to change. And I told the minister that countries in the world today, countries are like brands. And in fact, Switzerland is a very strong brand. And I'm sure you study that in the École de Commerce. But countries are brands. That's true for Switzerland. That's true for Bangladesh. And I told them, if people, when they look on the label, sur l'étiquette, made in Bangladesh, if it means made by slaves, modern slaves, people will don't buy that anymore. So you have a survival challenge now for you. You have to change your rules. And it was completely new in their mindset. And they improved the situation, guided in that by players of the philanthropy sector, and especially the German Agence de Development Agency, which is an umbrella with bringing a niche specialist for environment and anti-modern slavery, especially NGOs acting in the garment factory industry.
Thanks. I think that's a great example. I think you'll be happy to hear, or maybe you saw that the BGMEA, the Bangladesh Garment Expert Association, just launched their own sustainability report a few days ago. And on the second page, a full page graph which says "Made in Bangladesh with Pride." So I think they heard.
Yes, exactly. I'm glad to hear that. And really, if you realize that this tragedy is only 10 or 11 years before, it's very, very quick. So, and this is a good example, a best practice on which, of course, it's far from being perfect, but it's big, one of the most impressive changes, because it appears at all the levels, from the field, from the factory, from the wages of the workers to the rules. Because if the rules are not changed, you cannot. I remember in one of my missions in a country where human rights were probably one of the worst countries in the world for human rights. It was very dangerous to meet activists because they risked their life. I don't even mention this country, not to put them at risk. And I met secretly an activist, and I asked him, how is the situation in human rights in your country? And he told me, there is no violations of human rights. I said, how come? He said, no, because we don't have human rights, because our country has not endorsed and ratified the Convention for Human Rights. So that's very important to say that human rights, it's our rights. And so one has to push and to lobby for having these rights universalized. I mean, ratified, signed, endorsed, improved. And here, the role of a specific a role très technique, a very technician role of NGOs and philanthropy players can be key.
Okay. Thank you. And just to add, in the Bangladesh context, of course, there was also a compensation fund set up for the victims of Rana Plaza. It took a while to put it together, but at least some of the ones that either lost family members or were severely injured eventually received some compensation money, and that was mainly through philanthropic sources. Giulia, to conclude, do you have a final example for us where this interplay works particularly well and was necessary to achieve the desired objective?
Yes, well, I mean, François gave example of different actors that rather together to reach, an outstanding result. And I know that there was a question in the chat why we didn't have anyone from the private sector. So just allow me to give you just an example of what the private sector itself can do, combining the CSR and philanthropy. For instance, there is the VF Group, you might know well. There is the VF Corporation, which is a multi-brand company. Among other, they have brands which are used for outside sports. And they have also the VF Foundation. And the VF Foundation has the objective and purpose among its mission is to make the outside matter, which means to basically to make people understand that the environment is important, to protect it, and to advertise for its protection. And obviously, you would say that once again there is a business case, because if you need to protect climbing outside spaces for in order to use the VF Corporation product, because then there is no more sense to have this product. But at the same time, you have to know that in the last 4 years, VF Corporation has started to rethink its strategy toward a circular business model along the principle of the OECD of the 3R, which means redesign, reuse, and recycle. And obviously for that, you need to have the consumer embark in this journey. And this goes along the idea of what François said, that now we are at a point that we need to shift from CSR to consumer responsibility. And to make the consumer understand the importance of that, the foundation, the VF Foundation, played a key role to prepare, to put the seeds in the consumer's mind, to make them ready to then buy from VF Corporation recycled products, or to just borrow products instead of buying them. And this is here also a big play to role for consumer to be part of a new circular business economy model. So I think that's an example where just the business sector, by having CSR activity, but also philanthropic activity, can contribute to creating shared values.
Thank you, Giulia. I think at this point, I thank both of you, François and Giulia, and I'll hand over to Henri to pick up a couple of questions from the chat. We've received a few.
Thank you very much, Dorothée. Yes, I will, and perhaps I have a couple of questions of my own following this fascinating debate. Maybe a question which comes from Mr. Laurent Douac. He says, does, and if so, how, to which extent the new generation, the millennials, contribute to accelerating the shift, the paradigm shift that we've been talking about so far. So I think this is an interesting question. I'd like to broaden it a little bit, because we hear that whether it's since 15 years, like François is saying, or more recently, or whether it's accelerating, but we are in the middle of a real shift. Now, who are the authors and what are the mechanisms of that shift? We also talked about customers, we talked about investors, we talked about others. So my question is, who are the key players in that game? And perhaps, both François and Giulia can express their views. From François, I'd like to take this opportunity, because I think that it's a related question, to ask him to elaborate a little bit about what he said several times. in order to have human rights enforced, you need rights. Now, which, it's difficult to challenge that. But if you look at what is happening, there are fundamental changes which do not occur only because there are new rights, but because there are expectations from companies, and probably the larger they are, the more vulnerable they are, because they cannot afford not to meet the expectations. So you will probably come back on that. And again, who are the key players? I don't know who wants to start about that. Obviously, Dorothée, you'll have a say on that as well. So maybe Giulia, you start with the key players, and then François, including this specific question.
Yeah, well, the key players are certainly the investor, and we know that on the financial sector, there are regulations starting to be implemented at international, but also national level to make sure they take into account the risk into their decision and the investment decision and advice. Obviously, then the consumer too, as I said, are very important. We have said that taking into account human rights is part of the risk assessment to be done. What we maybe not have said yet is that one of the limits today of the legislation on the due diligence and the reporting obligation is that we don't find a way to overpass the fact that we go beyond the materiality of risk for the company to the severity of risk for those which are affected by this adverse impacts. And this is also because there is no right at the moment given to these people that are considered as external parties to the company. François, if you want.
Yes. Regarding the players, I think that I would just insist on the financial sector. If 10 or 15 years ago, I had a discussion with a law student, and if I have asked him or her, what are the white-collar crimes that one could face in finance or banking? And if the answer were genocide, terror, I would say, are you sure you want to be a lawyer? Maybe you'd rather do something else in life. But he or she would have been right, in fact, because today one of the major European banks is facing a prosecution for complicity of terror. Another institution is facing complicity of genocide because they have financed the weapons that could be used in a genocide. And so far in finance, the paradigm is where the money comes from, and with a prism which is to prevent corruption, money laundering, and tax fraud. But now we are changing the paradigm from where the money does come from to where the money is going to. And when the bankers and the asset manager will be held responsible for the consequences of their investment on fundamental rights and environment and climate, we will have a strong leverage. But now on your remark, Peter, regarding rights and this trend to have new players and new non-rights, non-legal regulations, I'm very hostile to that, I have to say. I agree that I'm very hostile to that. Because simply it has not the legitimacy of rights. We had, to be very concrete, a recent example, and I'm just, it's not only for the pleasure of provocation. I was very, I'm not, it's not a secret that I'm not a supporter of former President Trump. But I was very much shocked by the fact that a private company has decided to censor him without going through a legal process. What is the legitimacy of that? A company considers that it is his social responsibility to censor anyone. And when I say that human rights are rights and not moral, I should say I'm in favor of that. I'm against this interference of moral. Why? It's not more because I'm an immoral person, but simply because if we are on the field of moral and the lofty ideals, one could not find an agreement. Those who are for the gay marriage invoke moral arguments, equality, same rights for all. But those who are hostile to this gay marriage, they also have their moral arguments as well. So if we are on the field of moral, there is no possibility for agreement. And there is no, if there is no agreement, if there is no settlement, if there is no rule, common rule, it's simply un rapport de force. And Twitter could censor the president because the rapport de force was in favor of the company at this very moment. And I think one has to resist to that tendency. Rights are not perfect. They are the fruit of compromises. They are debated by...
François, let me, sorry, yeah, sure. Now, a question we get here is this, absolutely, which assumes that you have rights in place. Now, let's take the type of global issue we're talking about here, human rights or environmental issues. They're global, right? So they go beyond states. And what we hear and I see on my screen is that for any right, any rule to exist and be actually enforceable and actually be efficient, it needs to be global because the issues are global, which means that a rule has to be global. So in order to achieve what you're saying, which is certainly right, you need a global rule. Do you think that in today's world, you can have a rule which would be accepted by China, the US, Russia, and India, and the key players? Maybe, but I think what we see out there is that it is difficult. So isn't, let's say, the second best option to have this public opinion pressure? It might be moral and, you know, there might be different views, but pressure which is exercised on global businesses to make sure that they meet certain requirements?
Of course, if there is pressure made by public opinion or at least by the consumers, because sometimes people act differently, whether they think as a part of public opinion or as a single consumer. So if the behavior of the consumer are more responsible, it's very positive. But I'm not, as a former diplomat, I have to say that it's far from being perfect. It's in many aspects our world is very worrying, very dangerous, unpredictable. But there is no alternative but trying to have common rules, and we succeed in that. I mean, even though today I'm of the opinion that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights would not be adopted today, and the coalitions of people who are against this right or these rights are very unexpected and contre nature sometimes. I remember when I was representing France at the UN in Geneva, for example, for the Universal Periodic Review, we had to face criticisms by democracies such as Iran, Pakistan, Sudan, but also from America and Canada sometimes, for the same reasons. You do not respect communities' rights, for example. So the challenge is not globalization. The challenge is universalization. is to protect this very notion of universality of mankind. I think that the major challenge is there, is to fight against, and I try to answer your question, to fight against relativism, regionalism, culturalism, this idea that human rights should be different because they should not apply the same way depending on the culture, the religion, and the latitude. Everything I've seen on the field for many years, by witnessing a lot of victims, everything I have felt, I have heard, led me to the conclusion that there is no two different ways of suffering from torture, depending of your religion, of your culture, of your skin color. And one has to fight against this trend. And this would be, if you allow me just a final sentence, the most important remark I would like to share with you. For decades, the movement of human rights, to make a long story short, consisted in promoting the similarities of all the members of the human family before the differences. We all are different, but we belong to the same human family because we are human beings. This was a trend. But today, the trend is exactly the opposite. It consists in promoting the differences before the similarities. And this is very dangerous. And this happens as well in the dialogue with some countries who do not respect fundamental rights, but as well in our societies, where one could see people reivindicating their differences at a point, reaching a point where this goes before what should unite us as human beings. And I think this is the major challenge for all the human beings, and especially for the human rights community in the future.
Thank you. Giulia, briefly, and then I have a last question for Dorothée. Anything you want to add after these deep thoughts of François?
Yes, just to say that, as you know, Henri, obviously I share that there is this normative force of the consumer, but I think it doesn't mean that we don't have to promote a more structured legal implementation of all of it, because I think that the risk of mixing rights, obligation, invitation, and encouragement means that then the people believe that they have some rights where they don't have, be it from the consumer or also be it from the private sector or the philanthropic sector. And that we see also that now people start to want to play a role at the global governance level, which raises some question, as Doro said, on the democratic aspect of this involvement. And I think this derives also from the fact that we are a bit mixing the notion, and there are risks associated with that. There might be benefits, but there are also risks associated with this mixing of rights, obligation, and what is only encouragements.
Thank you, Giulia. Now, Dorothée, last word on your side, maybe because we are under the auspices of the Center for Philanthropy here, maybe in your closing remark, tell us if, as you said, but it was probably willingly provocative, you still think after this conversation that philanthropy is only about quote unquote recycling dirty money, to get a greenwashing effect. You mentioned the Sacre example, or if there is something which could be called true altruism, to quote a famous professor, Andreoni, true philanthropy, disinterested philanthropy, which is not a business, even not a business case, meaning that you do that because you have an interest, hidden or not. Dorothée.
Thanks, Henri. I enjoyed François and Giulia's contributions. And I think we made a good start in this conversation to figure out how to merge our fields of business, human rights, and philanthropy. And I'm a pragmatist. I think change comes from many sources. We heard that there are many ways to increase the leverage we have on company behavior from consumers, from investors, from growing legal expectations and public expectations. With human rights, the target is crystal clear. So how to get there, I'm quite pragmatic, and I want to activate all these sources to advance this field. And I see human rights and philanthropy as natural and absolutely necessary allies. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation to figure out the complementary nature and how to figure out a smart mix between those two fields that indeed, as François pointed out, shouldn't be seen as separate spheres, but ones that are overlapping and can reinforce each other. So thanks to all, Henri, Giulia, and François.
Thank you, Dorothée. It's for me to, on behalf of the center and your center, we're both working hands in hands here. Thank you for this really outstanding conversation. We went quite deep into the topics. It's certainly just the beginning of a conversation of thoughts. There's a lot of takeaway for each of us, I believe, but maybe very quickly, a couple of things. Business and human rights and philanthropy, they're not incompatible, right? And as François said, he said an oxymoron. So these are not separate, topics. They're actually maybe two sides of the same story, if one wishes to go a little bit, to push it a little bit. But so we're talking about that. Second, we have mentioned lots of concepts and words. We've been trying to define them. We have different definitions, different perceptions. But what we learn is, anyway, we shouldn't look at things in silos, in separate boxes. The concepts tend to blur and need to blur because they complement each other. And in the new paradigm we've been talking about, we see that. And in particular, human rights are compatible with business very, very clearly. That's a takeaway. It's not natural, but it can be done. And this is the message, I guess, that Dorothée is passing, and we certainly should all agree with that. And then there is no real choice. We will have, in a long-term view, as Giulia said, if you take a long-term view, whether you're talking about the states, which are, may sometimes businesses, but they're anyway brands, or corporations, some are even larger and more powerful than states nowadays, they have no choice. If they want to survive long-term, they have to abide by the expectations that we're talking about and fulfill and comply with the rights that have been mentioned and that still have to be codified, even though they're out there already somewhere implicitly. So there would be much more to say. I'm not going to add anything here. That was an enriching, I guess, occasion. Thank you, Dorothée, and thank you, François and Giulia, for your inputs. And this will continue. Now, before I close, let me show you very quickly, with Dorothee's helps, what is going on at the Geneva Center for Philanthropy. So briefly, teaching, we have two courses starting. The first one has to do with the cultural field, including archaeology, not only art, and this will start on 24th of February. It's online, it's open to public, it's delivered by Dr. Anne-Laure Brandley for a third time. It's an extremely interesting course. You're all welcome to follow that. And then we will start in September, actually, at the beginning of the next year's academic year in September, a new diploma of advanced studies in strategic and in operational philanthropy. That's a 1 year, actually 2 courses which run in parallel. You're welcome to follow that. The person in charge is Professor Giuseppe Ugazio at the faculty, same faculty as Dorothée of management and economy. And then we have our master classes, which we do together with the Swiss Foundation and the Basel Center, similar center in about philanthropy. That will occur at the beginning of September. The next slide will simply show you the next events. We have a similar philanthropy lunch on the 25th of March about the role of emotions, positive emotions in the motivation that you have to carry out philanthropy activities. Now, we're not too far from where we are today. It's just going to be taken from a psychological and philosophical angle and led by Professor Kova. Then we have found the foundations can be used as shareholders, shareholders of businesses, actually. And this is an important way to do things, because it's a way to ensure, for instance, that human rights are complied with. So you hear about that on 29th of April. This will be led by Delphine Bodger, one of our academic fellows. And on 20th of May, another topic which is not too far from what we to discuss today. This is going to be an afternoon with a keynote speaker, Professor Alec Edmonds, who wrote a book called How to Grow the Pie, and he explains how you can combine purpose of a company, raison d'être, as François called it, and profits. So you're welcome there as well. And we're going then to focus on 2 side issues, which is how can you foster this kind of initiatives, sustainable initiatives, through new financial means, and second, through tax incentives. I'm going to close here, thanking you all again and reminding all of you that we have this questionnaire. We'd love to have your feedback about what we've been doing. Thanks a lot, and hope to see you soon, hopefully not only on Zoom. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, everyone. Also, thanks to the audience for your interest.
Merci.